All right, men, before you ever say, I do, there's something about marriage you need to understand, because too many men discover it when the relationship is already ending. Marriage may begin with love, attraction, promises, and plans for the future. You meet someone you love, decide you want to build a life together, and eventually stand in front of family and friends, promising that you're in this for the long haul. But marriage doesn't exist only in the world of love. Marriage is also a legal contract, and men, I need you to understand what that actually means. The moment you get married, there are laws that can affect property, income, assets, debts, and financial responsibilities if that marriage eventually ends. The exact rules depend on where you live, but the larger point remains the same. You're making a legal decision alongside an emotional one. Yet think about how differently we approach weddings. People will read the contract for the venue, they'll negotiate with the photographer, they'll check what the caterer is charging, they'll ask what happens if something gets canceled. But how many men spend that same amount of time understanding the legal consequences of the marriage itself? That's where problems begin. I'm not telling you not to get married. I'm telling you not to enter something this important without understanding what you're agreeing to. Because when everything is going well, nobody wants to discuss what happens if things fall apart. But if that day ever comes, emotions won't be the only thing deciding what happens next. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from today. Drop your city or country in the comments so we can connect. Because once money, property, and marriage collide, the conversation can change very quickly. Now, here is where many men misunderstand what happens to money once marriage enters the picture. You may think, I earned this money, I worked for it, I built my career. Why should anyone else have a claim to it? But depending on where you live and how your finances are structured, marriage can change that calculation. Income earned during the marriage, property purchased together, retirement savings, investments, and even things created while you're married may become part of what has to be considered if you divorce. That's why I want men to stop thinking about this only after the relationship is already falling apart. By then, you're sitting across from lawyers asking, what can I keep? When the better question should have been asked years earlier, what exactly am I agreeing to? And this is also why conversations about prenuptial agreements become so uncomfortable. People hear the word prenup and immediately think, so you don't trust me? Or are you already planning our divorce? But that's emotional thinking. You buy insurance without hoping your house burns down. You write a will without planning to die tomorrow. Preparing for an unwanted possibility doesn't mean you're hoping it happens, and this applies to both men and women. If you've spent years building savings, property, investments, or a business, you should understand what marriage could mean for those assets. Because saying, I didn't know, after everything falls apart doesn't change the agreement you already entered. And that brings us to the question many couples would rather avoid. What should be discussed before the wedding, while you're still completely in love? And this is exactly why the conversation about a prenuptial agreement can tell you something important before the marriage even begins. Men, think about it. If two people can comfortably discuss where they'll live, whether they want children, how many children they want, and what kind of lifestyle they hope to build, why should money suddenly become the forbidden conversation? A prenup isn't romantic, I understand that. Nobody wants to be planning a wedding while discussing what happens if the marriage fails. But avoiding the conversation doesn't remove the financial consequences. It simply means the default rules where you live may make those decisions for you. And here's what I find interesting. The attitude toward protecting money can change very quickly when someone has substantial assets of their own. A woman who has built a successful career, accumulated investments, inherited family wealth, or created a valuable business may suddenly understand perfectly why someone would want financial protection before marriage. Because now it's her money potentially being affected. And men should pay attention to that. This isn't about assuming the woman you're marrying is secretly planning to take something from you. That's not the point. The point is consistency. If protecting assets makes sense when a woman has something significant to protect, then discussing protection shouldn't automatically become offensive when a man raises the same concern. Marriage requires difficult conversations before they become difficult problems. And if you cannot calmly discuss money while you're deeply in love, imagine how much harder that conversation becomes when the relationship is ending. Now let's talk about something that destroys marriages long before anybody files for divorce. The warning signs people keep ignoring. A man can say, I never saw it coming. One day she just decided she wanted out. And sometimes the final decision really does shock him, but go back 6 months, go back 2 years. What was happening between you? When was the last time you were genuinely intimate? When did conversations become shorter? When did affection disappear? When did you start sleeping beside each other but living completely separate lives? Imagine a husband saying, oh, I can't believe she was seeing somebody else. Then somebody asks him, when was the last time you two had sex? And his answer is 3 years ago. Men, 3 years without intimacy isn't a small detail. Something in that marriage has been asking for attention for a long time. That doesn't excuse cheating, deception, or suddenly walking out. But it does mean we shouldn't confuse not expecting the ending with there being no warning signs. Sometimes we see the distance and convince ourselves it's temporary. We notice the resentment, but keep going to work. We stop communicating and assume marriage will somehow repair itself. And before we continue, I want your opinion. Do you believe a man can genuinely be blindsided by divorce, or are the warning signs usually there but ignored? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you're enjoying this conversation, subscribe, because next we're getting into what being blindsided can actually look like when a man's entire life changes in a single day. And this is where being blindsided stops being an idea and becomes something a man can actually feel. Imagine having an argument with your wife before work. Nothing about it seems big enough to make you believe your marriage will be over by the time you come home, you get dressed, you leave the house, you go through your normal day. Then you return home and realize something is wrong. Her belongings are gone. Valuables have been removed. Pictures have disappeared from the walls and refrigerator. Things have been thrown away. The woman you expected to see that evening has moved out. No long conversation beforehand. No opportunity to prepare yourself for what you're walking into. Now think about what happens inside a man's head at that moment. First comes disbelief, then panic. What happens to the house? What happens to the money? What will divorce cost? What happens to everything you've spent years building? And then comes the emotional part people rarely discuss. You're embarrassed. You're angry. You don't know who to tell. You keep asking yourself how someone you were once so close to could make such a major decision and execute it without you fully realizing where things were heading. A man can spend years recovering from that kind of experience. Maybe there were warning signs beforehand. Maybe the marriage had been struggling longer than he admitted. But recognizing that afterward doesn't erase the shock of the moment. And that's why men need to understand something important. Seeing problems in your marriage and being prepared for its sudden ending are not necessarily the same thing. Now let's move into the financial side, because one of the biggest differences in divorce is often not simply whether you are the husband or the wife. It is whether you were the breadwinner or the person who depended more heavily on the other income. The person earning most of the money usually has a better idea of what is actually happening financially. They know what comes in, what goes out, what the mortgage costs, how much is being saved, what the investments are doing, and whether the household is living comfortably or stretching itself too far. The other spouse may know far less, and that can become dangerous. A person can be married for years and still not know exactly what they own, what they owe, what accounts exist, or how much money is really available. Then divorce arrives, and suddenly all of those questions become urgent. This is why I think financial awareness matters just as much as trust. You can trust your spouse and still know what is happening with your own household finances. You can love someone and still understand the accounts. You can allow your partner to handle certain responsibilities without completely handing over your knowledge of them. Because if one person knows everything and the other person knows almost nothing, the imbalance becomes obvious the moment the relationship ends. And men, this is especially important because being the provider can create its own kind of blindness too. You may know what you earn, but do you know what the marriage is actually costing you? What obligations could follow you afterward, and how much of your financial life is tied to the relationship you are building right now? Now, here is where the conversation becomes very interesting. What happens when the woman is the breadwinner? Because suddenly, some financial realities that men have dealt with for years can look very different when the roles are reversed. Imagine a successful woman who has spent years building her career. She earns most of the household income, contributes heavily to retirement accounts, builds investments, and watches her income continue to grow while her husband earns considerably less or stays home. Then the marriage ends. Now she's hearing that some of the assets accumulated during the marriage may have to be divided. Depending on the law where she lives and their circumstances, she may even face financial obligations toward her former husband. And suddenly she's asking, why should he get part of what I worked so hard to build? Men, does that question sound familiar? This is where the double standard becomes worth discussing. When a man earns more and divorce requires him to divide assets or potentially provide support, people may tell him, that's marriage. You knew what you signed up for. But when a woman becomes the higher earner, some people suddenly ask why an able-bodied man should receive anything from his former wife. The rules shouldn't become respectable or unfair, depending on which gender is writing the check. And that's the larger lesson. Being the breadwinner can completely change how someone views money, marriage, and divorce. It's much easier to be comfortable with financial sharing when you're not the person watching the larger portion of what you earned potentially leave with somebody else. But there is another financial mistake that can leave either spouse completely exposed: allowing one person to know everything about the money while the other knows almost nothing. And yes, this happens even in successful marriages. One spouse earns the money while the other handles the accounts. Or one person manages the investments, taxes, mortgage, retirement funds, and bills while their partner simply assumes everything is fine. For years, that arrangement may seem convenient. Then something goes wrong. Maybe the investments aren't performing the way you thought. Maybe credit card balances have been growing. Maybe the mortgage is becoming difficult to manage. Maybe income has dropped. But the family is still spending as though nothing has changed. And sometimes the spouse handling everything doesn't say anything because admitting there is a problem feels like admitting failure. Imagine a husband who has always seen himself as the provider. His wife doesn't want to deal with the finances, so he carries everything. Business slows down, money gets tight. Instead of telling her, he keeps trying to maintain the same lifestyle because he doesn't want his family to know he's struggling. Then eventually everything comes out. And the first question is, how could you let this happen? But I would ask another question: how did something this important become only one person's responsibility? Men, knowing your household finances isn't about controlling your spouse. It's about being an adult participant in your own marriage. Know the major accounts, know your debts, know what you're saving, understand your investments. Know approximately what comes in and what goes out every month. You can have accountants, advisors, and a spouse who handles the day-to-day details. But don't completely surrender your knowledge. Because if your marriage ends and you're asking a divorce lawyer what you own, what you owe, and where your money is, you've waited far too long to understand your own financial life. Now let's talk about something that creates tension in a lot of marriages. One person wants to save while the other person wants to spend. A man may work hard, watch his accounts grow, and feel good knowing there is money available if something goes wrong. To him, savings aren't wasted money, they're security. They mean the mortgage can still be paid if he loses his job. They mean an emergency doesn't immediately become a disaster. But his partner may look at the same money and ask, what's the point of having it if we never enjoy it? So the spending begins. Maybe it's another renovation because the kitchen suddenly needs updating. Maybe it's an expensive holiday, regular weekends away, new furniture, restaurants, or constantly upgrading the lifestyle because the household income has increased. And this is where resentment can grow. One person feels like they're working hard to build security, while the other feels like they're working hard and never getting to enjoy the life they've built. Neither problem gets solved by refusing to talk about it. And appearances can make things worse. You can see a couple with the beautiful home, nice cars, overseas holidays, and successful careers, and assume they're financially secure. You have no idea what's happening behind those doors. They may be carrying enormous debt. The breadwinner may be terrified about the next mortgage payment. Their investments may have fallen. Their expenses may have quietly overtaken their income. Then divorce arrives, and both people discover there isn't nearly as much money as they thought. That's why I keep coming back to financial awareness. Don't measure the health of your finances by the lifestyle you're able to display. Know the numbers, because sometimes divorce doesn't destroy a financially healthy household. Sometimes it simply reveals that the lifestyle everyone admired was already being held together by financial pressure. So, men, what should you take away from all of this? Marriage can be about love, loyalty, family, companionship, and building a future with someone, but none of those things remove the legal and financial responsibilities that come with saying, I do. That's why you cannot afford to enter marriage financially asleep. Know what you own, know what you owe. Understand your savings, investments, retirement accounts, property, and major household expenses. If you're considering a prenuptial agreement, understand how it works where you live and get proper legal advice instead of relying on what somebody told you online. And pay attention to more than money. If you and your wife haven't been intimate for years, don't pretend everything is fine. If conversations have disappeared, resentment is growing, you're constantly avoiding each other, or you're living separate lives inside the same house, those problems deserve attention. Don't wait until somebody is packing their belongings before admitting the marriage has been struggling. And don't assume being the breadwinner means you're automatically protected either. The person earning the most can still face serious financial consequences when a marriage ends. The person earning less can also be left completely confused if they spent years knowing nothing about the household finances. The lesson isn't to distrust your spouse. It's to remain involved in your own life. Love with your eyes open. Know the person you're marrying. Know the financial life you're building together. Know the legal commitment you're making. And don't ignore problems simply because confronting them feels uncomfortable. Because the worst time to learn what marriage means financially is when you're already sitting across from a divorce lawyer trying to work out what happens next. Men, what do you wish someone had told you about marriage before you got married? Drop it in the comments, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.